A killed his unwed sister B after a video of the latter kissing a man circulated online. When asked why he did it, A argued that what he did is an act of honor killing. Honor killing or shame killing is a practice of killing a female member by a male member of the family. The act is justified in some cultures as an act of cleansing after the female member allegedly brought dishonor or shame to the family. A lot of people will argue that practice in a culture should not be used as an excuse to commit a wrong. Killing is wrong or unethical regardless of whether it is accepted by one's culture or not. This kind of approach to moral questions is what is known as objectivism. Moral objectivism is a doctrine that moral norms or principles are valid for everyone, universal in other words, regardless of how cultures may differ in their moral outlooks. However, for those who argue that the act is justified because it is acceptable by their culture, adheres to cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is a view that an action is morally right if one's culture approves of it. Aside from moral and cultural relativism, there is also what we call subjective relativism. It proposes that an action is morally right if one approves of it. Moral rightness and wrongness are relative to individuals. Another extreme perspective is emotivism. Emotivism is an approach that states that moral utterances are neither true nor false, but are expressions of our emotions or attitudes. In order to deepen our understanding of these different perspectives in moral judgment, let's talk about each perspective and the problems that they pose. Let's begin with subjective relativism. In subjective relativism, a person's approval of an action makes it right for that person. What is wrong becomes a matter of personal taste and is therefore relative to every individual. Now, what are the implications if we adhere to this kind of perspective? First, man is morally infallible, and second, no moral disagreement can exist since judgments are only based on our attitudes towards a certain act. When we say that man is infallible, we are implying that a man is incapable of being in error. There is a failure to acknowledge that our perspectives and knowledge is limited to what we experience or what we've been exposed to. We have to remember that while the true, the good, and the beautiful are ideas and realities that are independent from human judgment, our perspectives are oftentimes blurred by the various things that we encounter, and our fallibility affects our understanding of the world. I guess this is the reason that when people fight and when one decides to give up either because he doesn't have anything else to say or he thinks that it is pointless to argue, one resorts to saying that it's futile to fight with someone who thinks he's perfect. Second, moral disagreements cannot exist. In subjective relativism, moral disagreements and moral judgments become irrelevant because the good or bad depends on how we see it individually. My idea of what is good might be different from yours, but we're both correct even though our beliefs clash. Unfortunately, that can't be the case. We may all be wrong, but we cannot all be correct. Next, we go to cultural relativism, the view that an action is morally right if one's culture approves of it. The doctrine is appealing because it promotes the humane and enlightened attitude of tolerance towards other culture. It is an acceptance that everyone exercises various cultures and that everyone is entitled to exercise such culture freely without moral judgment from other cultures. However, accepting cultural relativism also has its implications. First, moral infallibility. Remember that our culture is shaped by the constant repetition of actions by a group of people in a society, and these people, the framers of our culture, are very much like anyone else, imperfect and capable of making mistakes. Second, social reformers are always wrong. If we say that social reformers are wrong, we are saying that the social reformers are immoral and by definition are in error by going against their culture. However, we cannot deny that the reforms that are brought about by these social reformers led us to a more inclusive and enlightened society. Third, culture cannot be legitimately criticized from the outside. It is like saying that we cannot learn from other cultures as much as other cultures cannot learn from ours. And because there are no other points of references, a person within a culture cannot reflect on its own culture. It makes us uncritical about the norms of our own society. And finally, the idea of moral progress is in doubt. There is fundamental difficulty in the application of cultural relativism to moral questions because of varying cultures. Thus, the moral judgments per culture cannot be applied in order to prevent the clash of these principles. But one must remember that rejecting cultural relativism is not equal to intolerance, but rather an openness to criticism and acceptance of everyone's right to disagree. Criticism to cultural relativism as a moral perspective is not a rejection of moral diversity. While there are actions or practices that do not require moral judgment, there are also practices that we can reasonably judge as unethical or immoral. Respecting a range of cultural differences doesn't make you a cultural relativist. What makes you a cultural relativist is the claim that anything that is socially approved must thereby be good. Finally, we have emotivism. Emotivism is a non-cognitivist view or a denial that moral judgments are statements that can be true or false. Emotivists believe that moral judgments cannot be true or false because they do not make any claims and merely express emotions or attitudes. For the emotivist, moral utterances are something akin to exclamations that simply express approving or disapproving feelings. We have to remember that moral values and virtues are intrinsic, objective, and not dependent on anything outside of them and not subject to will. Good is good not because that is what a culture practices. An act is bad not because a person believes it to be bad. What is good, what is moral, what is ethical are universal principles that are applicable to all and are judged only through reason.